Hi, Jack.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. It's good to chat to you.
Yeah, but the first question is the hardest. What was your first computer?
It was a Dell laptop that I got for Christmas. I cannot remember the model, but it was like a really thick, chunky one that my parents bought me that was secondhand. And the main thing I remember being happy was that it could run Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, I think.
Oh, yeah.
At that point, and so I hadn't got into sort of programming at that point. I was just happy that I could play the computer game that I always tried to play on my dad's PC. So yeah, an old beat up Dell laptop of some sort, with like an hour battery life, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but Tycoon was actually a Linux game, right? Back then, it ran on Linux, I think.
I think it may have done, yeah. Quite a lot of the games. I think was it a Chris Sawyer game, Roller Coaster Tycoon. I think quite a lot of his games did run on Linux. So yeah, quite possibly.
So when you started to do something else than gaming or playing with your laptop?
So I played football here, or soccer, as some people might say, and we needed a website for like my team that I played in. So I would have been 13 or 14. And my dad actually volunteered to build the website, having never built a website ever in his life. He was just interested by it. We literally knew nothing about it, and we built the first version was dreadful. We were using, we were literally complete novices, and we were using Dreamweaver to WYSIWYG, drag and drop to create divs and all that. But then over time we started switching from that view into the code view of Dreamweaver and trying to figure out what was going on there. So we started learning HTML. I remember we bought Rachel Andrews' CSS book, which I sort of read cover to cover. And from there, I just kind of got really interested in it. Then I learned, taught myself PHP and built kind of a really, really rubbish blog, like PHP, MySQL, WordPress type thing, but obviously nowhere near as polished and good. And it just kind of spiraled from there, really. And then I found that I really enjoyed it, found it rewarding. And that was when I made the decision to kind of study at a university and have been a developer ever since, really.
Oh, so you said you studied at the university or no?
Yes, I did, yes. So I studied computer science at university.
So, and I mean, from CSS book to computer science is a huge step, I would say. What was your, were you shocked actually by the university or?
I wasn't too shocked because after the CSS, I taught myself kind of PHP, did a fair amount of PHP and JavaScript sort of before I'd gone to university. So I sort of knew, I knew a bit about programming kind of in the like traditional kind of programming sense. And so it was as expected. And by the time I went to university, I was also doing some like freelance web design development work for some people as well. So I had a rough idea what to expect. Some part of the course was a challenge, particularly the kind of graphical side of things and 3D gaming, that sort of thing. There were a few courses on that as part of my degree, and that really isn't for me. Like my head doesn't work in that way. But the more typical computer science programming side, I was fairly comfortable with. By the time I went to university, I knew what sort of stuff it was going to be.
So it seems to me like it was recently. So when you finished the university?
I left university nearly 8 years ago. So not that recent. Yeah.
Yeah, not that recent, but
longer every year. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Which programming languages you learned actually at the university?
We did all sorts. We started with Python at the beginning. That was sort of the classic beginning programming language. It seems actually a lot of people I spoke to who did computer science at uni, at least here in the UK, all seem to have done Python. And then there was a lot of Java. That was sort of the classic. And then there were a few kind of weird, not weird, but sort of niche languages. So we did a bit of Prolog, which is a really interesting language. You kind of describe and define like rules, and it figures out things based on those rules. Really interesting. We did a bit of like Lisp-based languages. What else did we do? All sorts, really. But most of it came back to Java in the end.
So your honest opinion. What's your opinion about Java?
I haven't touched it since I left university.
Okay.
So I'm not too up to date with it. At the time, I found it a little bit wordy and verbose. I remember thinking that. However, since then, I've kind of gone all in on TypeScript, and I'm much more confident with sort of the syntax of types and TypeScript and Java look pretty similar in a lot of
very
ways.
similar.
So I think if I were to use it now, I would be more comfortable with it. But yeah, at the time, I remember it feeling very wordy. It was also the first time I'd really met a compiler, and I remember getting very frustrated sometimes where it just refused to compile my code. And in hindsight, obviously, that was because I'd done something wrong and I had a type mismatch or something like that. But at the time, I just remember thinking, I just want to get this running. I just want to do the assignment and hand it in. And I felt like I was fighting it a lot at the time. But as I say, that's all 8+ years ago, so I'm not up to date on recent Java.
I'm just interested because I'm Java developer all the time, so always interested what is the perspective from other developers. And so after the university, what happened then? So you became a front-end developer?
Yes, not immediately. So I joined a fairly small startup in London that was about 40-ish people. And really, that was really good because they're at the stage where, as an engineer on that team, you had to do a little bit of everything, really. So I did a bit of front-end, but I actually primarily was a back-end developer. We were writing a lot of Ruby at the time. And I really enjoyed that side of things. And then the person who was really responsible for the front end, they left, and there was no dedicated front end person. And obviously, I'd done a fair amount of front end stuff in my time, and so I just kind of slowly moved into it and just found that I really enjoyed it. It was the right sort of place for me. I found it slightly more rewarding than the back end stuff personally. And so
you did
really
back end in Ruby. So you did back end Ruby back then. It was Rails.
Yeah. It was Rails,
the Rails story is actually interesting because what I remember is, I finished my university a little bit, earlier. And after then I did lots of Java work. And around 2006, I would say, the common perception was that Java is dead and Rails will just take over. And what happened then is, in my opinion at least, is that Rails became less and less popular. And I would say the popularity of Java is the same. I wouldn't say it is not like it. It's just like it is. But Rails, I don't hear about Rails anymore. It's like almost gone. Is it also your perception? Or
I feel like it's kind of just steady, at least from a sort of outsider's perspective who doesn't use Rails anymore. And so I don't proactively keep up to date. It doesn't. I think it had a big boom at the beginning. I can still remember watching that initial video that DHH did where he kind of built this blog in like 10 minutes using Rails and all the scaffolding and stuff. I remember thinking that's absolutely amazing and that's incredible. But yeah, it seems to kind of it's like a steady community now, at least from the outside. I really enjoyed it. I think Ruby is a nice language. And sometimes I try and do a little bit of back-end programming just in my spare time to keep up to speed of it. I should probably try and write some Ruby soon. But,
or Java,
after
the
Java,
talk. Oh, Java, of course. That's just kidding. But
absolutely.
What surprised me because Ruby was, to my perception of Ruby, was like a really beautiful and DSL-like language where you can craft nice code. And what my perception is that actually Python is far more popular right now than Ruby, right? So it like actually took over. And Python, so if you compare Python with Ruby, what do you like more, Python or Ruby? So now your personal opinion about that.
I like Ruby a lot more. I have more Ruby experience than I do Python experience, so I'm probably biased for sure. But in my head, I've just always found Ruby easier to write. The whole ecosystem around it seems nicer to me. Sort of Ruby Gems seems like a nicer experience than, I've forgotten the name, the equivalent Python thing.
Django.
Django, and then the thing that manages dependencies, like the sort of bundler, Ruby's bundler equivalent. Pip, that's it, Pip. So the previous place I worked had a sort of Python Django backend. I didn't really get involved with it, but I just felt like every time I had to touch that, I was fighting it more. And that probably is because I don't have as much experience compared to Ruby. But just even if I were to load up the same sort of application written in both languages, like to me, in the way maybe that I work and my head works, I find Ruby easier to follow and understand. That's not to say it's perfect, but for me, I've always been a Ruby over Python person.
Yeah, this is why it really surprises me that in the cloud and so forth, Python becomes more and more popular and not Ruby. This is my big surprise. But interesting, right? Maybe because Python comes with all the scientific libraries which are used by the scientists, a bit more machine learning and so stuff, and Ruby less so. Ruby was more like a backend, how to call it, web language, right? So
yeah, I'd agree with that.
Nice. So you became then a front-end developer, so from Ruby backend to front-end. What you did in the front-end?
So when I first sort of made that transition, we were working with Angular, AngularJS, like version 1.
1 or 2?
And 1. So
Okay.
not the new one, the old one, as it were. And we were building sort of dashboards and things on top of a JSON API. And that was fine. We were also starting to, that was around the time that ES modules were starting to exist and the first bundlers were starting to support them. So we were looking into that quite a lot as well. I remember being really excited that finally in JavaScript you could import things like you could in Ruby and other languages that I'd used. So that was, I remember being very, very excited when we were able to do that, and we set up, I don't think it was Webpack, it was a bundler before kind of Webpack and that sort of set. But when we got that working, that was very exciting. And then after that, that was just when React came out as well, and we were building a new website, kind of a standalone marketing site, and we were doing React for that. And actually server rendering React as well, kind of right at the beginning.
Why you switched from Angular to React?
We wanted to try React because it was new and it seemed quite compelling compared to Angular. Like, it felt lighter weight, and the sort of component model felt like a nice fit. We also, from the get-go with that website, we were immediately server-side rendering it as well, which React could do out the box. I don't remember if Angular could or not. And it was also a website that we were going to maintain, but we needed people non-engineers had to be able to, say, update text on a particular page or add a new page. And so we felt that React with its JSX could be a good option there, because the people in sort of the marketing and whoever, they knew enough HTML to edit a web page. So we felt that a little server-side rendered React app with what to them looks like HTML that they could go and update would work quite well. And it did. It went fairly well.
What I remember back then, it was huge. It was very controversial, the JSX and React, because everyone said, okay, there's now the logic and the presentation are not strictly separated. And this is why it is really hard to maintain. And I just tried React back then, and I really like it. So, I mean, regardless of what the theory says, it is perfectly viable, to have everything in one place. And the Java developers, I'm one, they were diverse because they told you, okay, you cannot do this. I would like to have strictly separated template from the Java logic. But we had it for years in Java. There is another framework called JSF, so it was strictly separated. The problem with the separation always is you have to look in two places, right? If you change something in the template, you have to keep your code in sync, which is maybe it is the best practice, but it's not very productive. So I really liked the React experience from the beginning, actually. What I didn't like, at the beginning, they had really a strange custom syntax. So you could write, like DSL-like language, all the components. I ignored that. But as they introduced the preprocessor, I think, where you could just use HTML, I think it looks like lit HTML right now. You could have like a directive, and then write the code. This worked really, really well. And regarding Angular 1, another question, because Angular 1, I really like Angular 1 because it was very similar to Java. So there's like request, you can put stuff on the request and render the requests in the view. So it was actually a really nice framework. And then Angular 2 came out, and I say, okay, forget it. I mean, this is like complete different experience. So this has nothing to do with Angular 1. And then I think all projects from then were Angular in my world, and later web components, but Angular. And what is your opinion, Angular 1 versus Angular 2? So I mean, just of course, it's just opinion.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with. I haven't used Angular 2. I think.
Okay.
The benefit of hindsight from the outside, I would have considered renaming it entirely. I think that caused a lot of confusion. I don't know, it's Angular and AngularJS. I think maybe just a different name, just being really upfront about that. No, we're done with that now. We've learned from it. We'll maintain it for a year and then that's it. It seems to have worked out in the long run. It seemed, again, from very much from the outside, just from like Twitter and things, Angular seems to be doing well. It has a fairly solid community but behind it, and there are people who absolutely swear by it and love working in it.
Of course.
I think it's gone well
especially
now.
Java developers. Developers love it. So whatever I say, about React Web Component, no, Angular is the way to go. So this is I'm in more dangerous place than you are, because this is what I wanted to ask you, because it seems to me like Angular is only popular in Java space or .NET space by developers, by enterprise developers. If I look outside, there's basically no Angular. So I am not aware of any young, fresh project who decides to use Angular. This is at least my perception.
Yeah, I don't know any either, but that may just be that I've missed them.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
I would say it seems. I think the Angular, if you pick Angular, you're kind of going all in on Angular and everything it gives you out the box. And I can see the appeal of that. I can see the appeal of picking one thing that gives you everything, like your entire toolbox. And there are a lot of pros to that. And I can easily picture, if you're a big company, lots of people who are familiar with Java. My understanding is Angular in some ways kind of fits that mental model.
Exactly.
I can really see the appeal. But I think if you don't have that kind of affiliation with something like Java, where you have some of that sort of familiarity, to me, it's not something I would personally reach for on a project. I find it a little bit heavy and overwhelming myself.
So, long story short, you were happy with React, right? Because you moved from Angular 1 to React, you tried it out, and you like that. So this is also my experience. And I also actually, I suggested React to some of my clients or smaller companies. And they are so happy with React that if I mention web components, whatever, say, no, it works. Just leave me alone. It works perfectly. So they are really happy about React. The only problem I have with, the Angular Next or Angular 2 Plus, whatever you call it, is it comes with lots of dependencies. And you have maintained the dependencies all the time, because the Angular uses the semantic versioning, so they are constantly pushing releases. And what do you have to do? You have to keep, the pace. So you have to, to constantly update the entire code base, or not update the code base. You have to update the dependencies. And in enterprise projects, it can be challenging, because sometimes, the enterprise project is done, and there is done the updates are not planned. If you wait too long, you get, the security problems with the dependencies. And the pipeline stops because it was no more updated. So this is what I see. This is why I try to avoid frameworks with too many dependencies. But this is my Java point of view. This is also what I do in Java all the time.
Yeah, that has become a big part of my strategy broadly, is avoiding dependencies, or avoiding is maybe too strong, but keeping the set of dependencies that you need to update as few as possible.
Yeah, it's just really crazy, because you come from complete different background, and my background is even worse than Java. So I don't know whether you heard about such a thing like J2E or Java-E. So this is what I actually did a lot, and I still like it. And the interesting part is, it is said, this is heavyweight or whatever, but the long story short is we didn't have any dependencies. So the only dependencies we had was like the dependency to the API, to the application server, and then we could implement our business logic. And I did more front-end work. I expected the same, right? I would say, okay, where is my, API, my browser API, and I would like to code against the browser API. And instead, I have to fiddle with lots of JavaScript dependencies and updates and builds and compiles. It's like, this is like crazy world. Why? What's happening here? Everyone says, how beautiful JavaScript is lightweight, and if you compare it to Java, it is completely inefficient and actually unproductive. Different story was React, actually, because, and also what I liked about React, to my knowledge, as long as I work with React, there are no incompatible changes. So we could update the dependencies, and it worked surprisingly well. So at least my experience. Have you encountered any problems with breaking changes?
Not problems. Off the top of my head, I think there have been one or two. I think the advantage you have with React is, because obviously Facebook use it extensively internally, is they really feel the pain of a breaking change, because they have to make that change across all the things that they have. So what I think they've been very good at, a breaking change happening over sort of 12, 24 months, where you get deprecation warnings for a long time, and then only then after a very long period do things actually get kind of removed. But also, I think they often will release a code mod, like a tool you can run against your source code to transform it into the new thing that is supported. So I think they handle that fairly well. But yeah, I would have said that broadly, when I was working with React, I remember being able nearly always to just keep upgrading and never really hit too many big issues, like the odd rename or something, but nothing major that caused problems.
Maybe the biggest one was the React hooks, which was recently added, which is not a breaking change, it's a different philosophy, right? The early React was class-based, and the React hook is like function-based. You used React hooks, or?
Yes. Yeah, I did. Yeah. So when they came out, I was in the middle of my previous job where we were sort of a React, fairly full-on React front end. So yeah, we made the decision to embrace hooks for all new code. But as you said, all our old stuff kept working, no problems.
Yeah. So very briefly to listeners, what are React hooks? And first, can you briefly explain it? What it is?
Yeah, so when React released hooks, the idea was you were able to, rather than define a React component as a JavaScript class with various methods on, you could instead define a React component as literally a function that returns some JSX in React land. So whereas in the class-based system you had these methods you could define, such as component did mount, I think was one, which would automatically get called for you when React rendered your component into the page. Those are gone in this function world. So instead what we have are hooks. So the equivalent would be one called use effect. And the way I think about this is it's like a side effect of your component rendering. It's like when my component renders, I need to run a thing, and that thing would be called an effect. And so what you have inside this React function is you call these hooks like use effect, pass in a function, and React will call that function for you when your component gets rendered or re-rendered. The complication with hooks is that you might want that function to only run sometimes, or when a particular value changes, or only on the first render, or only just before a component is removed, or any of these kind of situations. So you can then specify to use effect the dependencies that should trigger a rerun. So I go back and forth on this. I think I've leaned more towards the side of hooks actually being, they give you more chance to shoot yourself in the foot, because it can be easy to write a hook that runs far too often and can cause confusion. But broadly, I liked them when they were introduced. Having used them fairly extensively, I'm really on the fence as to if they are superior to the class-based approach. I think often the code looks neater, but I think it can be more confusing too.
Okay, so this was my next question. So if they came out, the hooks, they were announced, and you look at the code, you like the code immediately? Or you said, okay, I would like to keep the classes going?
I think I liked it. I leant towards thinking, I would. Or put it another way, when it came out, I immediately the next week we upgraded, and I thought, right, I'm going to build a component using hooks now to get a feel for it. Like, I was excited to try them out. I think for basic components, they work well. And there were downsides to the class-based system. You know, if you had some code that had to run with a component mounted and some that ran when it got removed, that code that was related had to be in two separate methods, one in the component did mount and one in the component will unmount call. So you had related code separate across your class. If you have that as a hook, you can do that all in one effect, because you have the code that runs and then you can return a function that gets run when it gets cleaned up. So there were pros and cons. In my opinion, the issue with hooks is because now you've got this function component that's running every single time your component gets updated, the entire function reruns. That's confusing, and it doesn't really work properly, because what happens is you just get like stuck in this messy world where you have hooks trying to rerun all the time, and it can get lost. And then because you've got things rerunning, you then have things like use callback or use memo or these other hooks that were introduced to try and help you maintain state across these re-renders when your entire function is running every time. And my head gets a bit flustered at that point. I sometimes struggle to figure out exactly what I'm doing in that world. And so to me, I'm not a huge fan now.
What I used in the class-based approach back then is if I had multiple methods, the callbacks methods, component did mount and component mount and whatever, I just called another private methods, there are no private methods in Java developer, methods inside the class, and so I could share the code. So this was my approach, and this was actually understandable. I would say it was easy to grasp. And I look at the hooks. I got the idea. I found them interesting. What I thought is dirty at the beginning, but again, I'm Java developers, that, per convention you are returning an array and you have to know that the first, slot is something and the second is another thing. But it seems like, the JavaScript community, no one complained about that. So, okay, this is actually strange because in Java, if someone will do this, we would immediately get, complaints. What you are doing is like crazy. But it seems like this pattern is common, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone got excited by them. And I think also the JavaScript community, so much has been changing over the recent few years. Like, there's been a really serious pace of innovation, even from all the way back to ES modules happening, and then ES 2015 with classes and other stuff added, and then and then all these various frameworks, your Angulars, your Vues, your Reacts, your whatevers. And so I think the JavaScript community, potentially more than others, is kind of open to seeing like wacky new ideas that maybe other communities that are more mature and stable and settled maybe would be a harder sell to those. So for me, I think that enables this experimentation. And, and clearly as well, I think with React, I said, it's Facebook behind it, they've got a lot going on. There are reasons and motivations for them bringing hooks in. Like I trust that they didn't do it just to make it different. There will have been good motivations behind it. And so I think sometimes that also enables people to be like, okay, well, this is maybe slightly different, but we're willing to give it a go.
I think the reason for webhooks was that they are able to lazy load stuff afterwards, right? You have more control what is loaded. This was, I think, the motivation behind the scenes, as I remember.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. I think, but yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go back.
Yeah, but exactly. So you changed the companies, right? So this is what happened. So after your React journey, you changed the companies to where?
Yeah, so I'm at Google now, and I've been here for two and a bit years now.
Wow, okay.
So
and what are you doing?
I was doing React before, and now I work on the Chrome DevTools team. So most developers have come across it once or twice, the inspect element and all that. Currently, I lead the performance stuff, so the DevTools performance panel. There's a new panel coming called Performance Insights, and kind of so I've got a heavy focus currently on web performance and helping developers figure out how to make their sites faster, better, nicer experience for their users.
I didn't know about that. So this is actually crazy. So what you are doing actually is you have a huge impact right now, right? Because whatever you're doing, it's going to be shipped, to lots of clients.
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah. And yeah, so we've worked on this Insights panel, which I think launched in Chrome as we record this literally yesterday in 1.02, which is the idea here being that the current performance panel has all the data you need, but it's very hard to break down. Whereas the Insights panel, you record your website and we try and pull out the most useful bits to you. So yeah, it's one of the things that appealed to me about working on DevTools is the ability to hopefully have a really positive impact on developers to help them fix issues, improve their website, which ultimately should lead to, whatever they're building being more successful because their website provides a nicer experience. And I feel very lucky to work on something where hopefully we can have a positive impact in that way.
And the interesting part is, I always know if you see a browser, Chrome, I would suspect, the entire browser is written in C or in Go or in Rust or whatever. But it seems like that you are actually using web frameworks to implement, the components in the browser itself, right?
Yeah. So Chrome itself is C, but Chrome DevTools is a front-end application that gets run within that. There's a few bindings to talk to the C stuff, but yeah, DevTools is a web application. Theoretically, you could run it in a browser, not attached to Chrome. Whether that would actually work in practice, I don't know. But it is all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or in our case, TypeScript, but JavaScript effectively. So yes, we do build it primarily with web components.
Exactly. And so what you did, you actually moved. You started with web components without React, right? This was your idea right now.
Yeah, so see, DevTools is very old and very big. So that we've got UI code that was written 15 years ago. So then it's all very much, there's a bespoke widget system in DevTools that was built way before any frameworks or components were floating around.
Were they still JavaScript, the old widgets?
Yeah, all JavaScript.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And which framework was it back then? Own framework or
completely custom? Just DevTools his own thing.
Okay.
And yeah, so now we're and it's working. If you use DevTools, you've used it obviously, and it all works fine. But that sort of feels a bit outdated for this new component-based sort of place that we're at now as a community. So yes, we now build all new UI using web components with a little sprinkle of lit HTML on top, which is a very small library to help with re-rendering efficiently. But other than that, it's all native JavaScript web components without much on top.
And do you have any state management, like frameworks like Redux or similar, where the changes just make re-render the HTML part, or how you deal with this?
We don't know. So we kind of have like a whole thing called the SDK, which is the part that talks to the Chrome backend, and it's the part where we ask it, okay, what styles are applied to this element, things like that you need to be able to show in DevTools. So there's data there, but no, we would listen in a particular component. We would listen to events and trigger a re-render when data changes. So it's much more. There's a little bit of boilerplate involved, and I would say it's less quote unquote magical than other frameworks where you just set some data and it magically knows what to update. Often we will say, okay, if this thing has changed, re-render. There are pros and cons to that. I think we probably write slightly more code. However, what I've come to really like about that approach is that I can always track down why something was re-rendered, because nothing will ever magically re-render without me asking it to.
Yeah.
And that's the big benefit.
It's interesting because what I'm doing, so I actually stopped using React at the class-based approach, and then clients ask me what we do in the front end. And with my Java background, I took a look, at the use the platform movement. So actually, this is exactly reflects my Java ideas. And it's like what we can do, and I find web components. So the problem with web components is, they are great custom elements, but there is nothing what they can render. And at that time, Polymer framework was big, but it was a little bit chatty. I didn't like that because you had to write a lot of code to do something. It was also too much magic. But then what the reminder of Polymer is actually lit HTML, right? So the lit HTML renderer is actually, it looks like JSX and React, I would say, is similar. And what I like about that the HTML is basically a JavaScript function. This is how it's called, tagged template, I think. So on steroids, I would say. And what lit HTML does for me, it calculates the diffs. So if I re-render the entire lit HTML, it knows exactly what changed, which is fine for me, for my project. So what I'm doing is actually the following. This, my project, our enterprise project, I would say, is a little bit complete different story to yours. But we are the view is talking to a set of JavaScript functions. We call it control, and it talks to the backend. It's just everything is asynchronous and void, so there is no return values. And then with fetch, standard fetch, so the results coming back, and they are modifying the Redux state. So we have a very simple Redux state, and the Redux state just calls re-render everywhere. And because lit HTML knows what changed, it is fast enough for enterprise project and very simple. So we have fully asynchronous pipeline. The developers are using custom elements. They write HTML whatever they like, and we have no dependencies except lit HTML. And we use rollup for build. So we don't have any transpiling. It's very simple. What we for I have to admit, for intranet enterprise projects, we don't even bundle. So we zip everything and we just use straight ES6 with Visual Studio Code. We get TypeScript behind the scenes, so the code completion is good enough. So we don't even have any transpilation, and it works surprisingly well. Actually, Java developers really like it, and they are surprised that something like this is not a standard. And I'm also surprised if I show this somewhere. The first question I get: why are you not using any framework? I would say, okay, but if this is the browser API, why I should to use something different? I mean, this is what the browser does anyway. And if you use a framework, the framework will have to talk to exactly the same browser API anyway. So it's not like they use something magical and go outside. No, they have to talk to the DOM, and they have to use the fetch at the end of the day, because there's no other way around. So what I see in JavaScript world, you have to justify yourself why you're not using a framework, which is really strange, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, obviously, I'm equally biased because of what I do currently, but I think so. I wrote a blog post recently on this subject, talking about why for various side projects and obviously at work we don't use React, and I've been, when I joined the DevTools team, I knew we weren't going to be using React, and I was a little bit concerned because I'd been using React for 5-6 years at a couple of prior jobs, and I wasn't sure how I would adapt to that. But actually, I would, there are frustrations, of course, but broadly, I've been pleasantly surprised by the web and the platform's abilities now relative to where we were a few years ago. Now, I'm also fortunate that I work on a Chrome thing, so I only have to worry about things being supported in Chrome. And I appreciate some of the things that we use are only supported currently in Chrome. But I think the web has come a long way, and I think there was justifiable reasons 7-8 years ago, maybe even 5, to reach for a framework. But now, especially with things like lit HTML, you can actually get a lot further than you used to be able to with components, and also not feel like things are breaking down. Like, it feels like a very robust system that's in place. I think the challenge is getting people to try it. I'm not here to say that everyone should ditch React immediately, and I don't think necessarily that that's the right move for everyone. But yeah, I have the same. Get so many replies to this blog post. Oh, how come you're not using React? So no, but how have we got to the point where the default state is to reach for this framework? And it's not. I'm not even picking on React. You can replace React here with any of the equivalents. And I think there's a lot to be said to just trying out components first, or web components, before reaching for something. I think there needs to be a high bar to justifying the extra addition of a framework like React, in my opinion.
So the limitation to my approach are clear, because my state management is simple. But the lit HTML re-rendering, if you have lots of changes, is still too slow. So but it works for enterprise applications, but if I would have, hundreds of bindings per page, you will maybe see, that it renders too slow. But if you would use React Fiber, for instance, it is a way faster than my approach. So one approach would be, if you have lots of moving parts or dashboard or whatever, then React and Fiber will be more responsive than my approach with lit HTML. But what I find interesting in your approach is the only difference between our architectures is that in my case, I have the Redux store. And what you have, it seems like you have like a event listener layer, which listens to events from the Chrome browser and calls, the updates on lit HTML. You have like an adapter layer, right? This is the main difference between our approaches.
Yeah, that's broadly it, but that happens on a component level. So a component can listen out to when something in the CSS model changes for a particular element and be notified about that. And then what if a component is given some data, it will just be defined as like a setter. And then when we get some new data, if it's different to the old data, we'll just trigger a render. And we've only had one instance where lit was struggling to re-render, and that was in what we call the data grid, which is effectively a fancy HTML table, with sorting and filtering, all that kind of classic stuff. Because some of the tables get really big, and we have a thing called the protocol monitor, which is actually, you can see all the messages that the backend is sending to the front end or vice versa. And that can get rapidly updated a lot. Not many people use it. If you're building a website, you've no need to ever use this. And lit was really struggling because we were ending up with tables with tens of thousands of rows. And not just lit was struggling, the browser was struggling just to keep this thing up to date. So there we ended up having to implement sort of virtualization. So we actually only render the rows that are visible. All the other rows are never rendered into the DOM. And as you scroll, we update which set of rows we render. But touch wood, other than that, we haven't had any big performance issues or pages that have needed additional work to re-render efficiently. Lit is very good at that. And because it uses tag templates, all the HTML that isn't inside like a dynamic interpolated part, lit knows will never change because it's static. So it can do some quite smart stuff. And so far we haven't hit upon too many issues with that. What's nice is we talked a lot about internally about the inversion of control. And what's nice about web components is you're not handing off control to your framework. And so in React or anything else, you change some data, React will decide if it needs to re-render or not. With our approach and lit, we decide when to re-render. And what that means is if you've got particular case where you need to do something different, you are able to do that because you've kept control. So you can say, actually, in this time, we're not going to call lit re-render, whatever, because it's inefficient, let's say. We're going to do this special custom thing for this one-off component. And so I think keeping control, which you do with components and custom elements, is a real big win, and something that more people should think about, I think.
What I also did in my project was, if you go so if you render the component by yourself, you can provide some nice console logging. So what we did, how it's called? Console.begin and end, right? So you can have your own hierarchical view in the not begin and end. You can name, the outputs. And if we did it in the rendering part, so I saw exactly, this component rendered this component. You see the entire tree, how it rendered, how fast, and this was trivial. It was like maybe 20 lines of code. We only wrapped, every method which rendered with start and end, and we provided the name. This is a built-in functionality of console.log, and this was basically it. And we saw exactly what happens behind the scenes, and you can debug it also very easily. But your conversation is actually great. I didn't knew that actually you are working that deep with Chrome, because I can tell actually my clients lit HTML will basically cannot die anymore because it's a part of the Chrome experience, right?
It's baked into DevTools. It's one of the very few dependencies we have. We really don't have many at all that get shipped as part of the bundled DevTools. And what we also do with the reason we say are happy depending on something like lit HTML is firstly because the browser doesn't provide anything equivalent to that, but secondly because let's say suddenly lit HTML disappears. It is a small dependency. There will be alternatives that do what it does that will exist. Equally, we could fork lit HTML and maintain it ourselves if we really needed to. That's not what I want to do, but we could. So I always think about, if we were having this discussion 10 years ago, we'd be talking probably about was it Backbone.js and Knockout.js and all these things that were really good at their time, but are not active now. And so what we, as a responsibility to whoever is maintaining DevTools in 10, 15 years, I don't really want to burden those people with picking, let's say, a framework like React, where hypothetically in 10 years, it might not be actually being developed, worked on, and we might be leaving a huge thing that this future team have to maintain and deal with. Whereas if we leave them a thing with just lit HTML as the only bit that is out of date, that's a much healthier place to be in.
It's exactly the same thinking in enterprise projects, because they are done and they are just in maintenance mode, and no one cares about the dependencies. And if you forget the dependencies, they will bite you in one point of time. This actually is funny. So you have exactly the same problems I have, in my world with in enterprise development. So about React, one question I always ask myself is, Facebook uses React for a reason, but they also see that the platform becomes more and more capable. And in one point of time, also Facebook has to recognize that actually, if they will don't use React, and they would just write custom ES6 and lit HTML or whatever replacement is, because at the end of the day, lit HTML are actually two functions, right? HTML and render. There are two functions we can very easily write. But you cannot write it easily by yourself, but you could. It is not like a mission impossible. And in one point of time, maybe Facebook comes to the conclusion, new applications are going to be written in vanilla web. This is very viable, idea. And then React could be in trouble in a few years. Just as my thinking. And this is right. This is what I also try, because Facebook invests a lot, but the Facebook engineers are not like, they are using React for a reason. But for now, it solves a problem. But in one point of time, the browsers get more and more capable, or the mobile devices get more and more capable, and there is no more reason for a framework. And then is the question, what happens then? Because it's always interesting what happens if the main contributor to our open source framework fades away. And this really interests me, how realistic this is. In one point of time, in my experience, it has to happen, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really the first question I would ask myself, or we ask, is when we are considering depending on something, is what is the worst case scenario for us? And the worst case for any front-end dependency is it disappears. It stops being maintained just one day out of the blue. And I think, I have no insight into what Facebook's plans are at all, but you could reasonably suggest that it wouldn't be outrageous to suggest in 5 years' time that they've moved beyond it, or they've changed it substantially so that people running React now will have to do a huge upgrade job to move to keep up to date, and they may not be able to, and then what happens then? And you can swap React here. I don't want to pick on them specifically, because it's the same theoretical story for any of the big frameworks at all. So I think I'm just extra wary of sort of choosing a horse and sort of building everything on top of it. And as I said, that's what's so nice about lit HTML or using dependencies of that sort of size and stature. Is it's a small dependency in our code base to do one small job. If it disappears, we can maintain our fork, we can replace it with an alternative. Worst case, as you said, we could build it ourselves if we really needed to. And so that, to me, feels like a much more maintainable, healthy, long-term approach. But then also, if you're building a project and you know it's only going to be around for a year and then you'll leave it, is React a bad choice? Maybe not. But I think it sounds like, particularly for both of us, the kind of software we work on, it's got a bigger lifespan than maybe others. And so therefore that is maybe top of mind, where it's not always for everyone. But I think it should be higher on the list of things front-end engineers think about than it is.
Are you using any bundlers for that, or what's your bundling and transpilation story?
Yeah, so everything runs through TypeScript, and we use a sort of Chrome or Chromium open source specific thing called Ninja to do the building. And we do then, when we bundle it, we use Rollup as well to bundle things down into one
exactly
file.
What I use Rollup as well. What does the Ninja does? What is it? What is actually the responsibility of Ninja?
So Ninja is like a generic build tool where you tell it all your inputs and you tell it what outputs you're expecting. And it figures out, and you tell it like the dependencies and the relationship between all these things, and it figures out for a given file change all the files that need to be recompiled. So it's a little bit more work than, say, a Webpack, because you have to give it every single file that exists and tell it about all the relationships. Like Ninja won't figure that out from your JavaScript code. Ninja isn't JavaScript specific; it's very generic. So we built a integration, a TypeScript Ninja integration, to enable us to use the two. But it's effectively just a build tool designed to build like the number of files that we have, that potentially a tool like Webpack would be less capable of doing, purely because DevTools is really big. And there are a lot of similarities between Ninja and the thing Google uses internally on its closed source code to build to. So it kind of keeps us slightly in line with the rest of the company too.
And I assume then that the rollup is pretty basic, right? In your case, I mean, if you're using lit HTML and TypeScript, it's just a transpile, and then maybe you have the how it's called the conversion of ES modules to that makes the ES. I forgot the plugin, the module resolver, whatever the name is. Where
no, we don't have that either. So we if we import lit HTML into our code, we import the full path in. And so we don't rely on any of the node resolution stuff in our front end build. So TypeScript takes every file and spits it out as JavaScript. Rollup takes all those JavaScript files and just merges them, rolls them up, and that's it.
This is exactly what I'm doing as well. So I'm using also the path, so / or whatever import. So we are not using the how it's called, the logical or the node modules. We use the standard modules. But Chrome is going to, or already supports the, how it's called, you could actually specify in the browser how the imports are resolved, right? There's new spec.
Import maps.
Import maps, exactly. Yeah. So it's already supported by Chrome, right?
Yeah, I think so. Don't quote me on that. I don't know if it's behind a flag or it's in stable Chrome. I think it may well be stable now.
It is stable, and I even think that the Firefox also supports it already. So
quite possibly. I would have to double check, but I think so. We haven't actually used it yet, but it's definitely something that we've been keeping an eye on, and probably will at some point. Like I like the idea of being able to replace all the links to like .. front end / third party / lit HTML blah blah blah. I like the idea of being able to replace that with lit HTML and not having to worry about paths, because we do end up with some very long path imports. But equally, it's not really an issue that's really slowing us down too much. So we're not kind of jumping at it yet. But I do really like import maps as an idea. And I think developers are so used to be able to say import foo from lit HTML or even import from React, and it just work. So I like the fact that we'll be able to do something similar in the browser.
Because right now, the only reason I sometimes have to use the bundler is exactly the import, because it's cannot be understood by the browser. So I need the plugin, what I forgot, Action Rollup, which translates the name to a path. This is what happens behind the scenes, and then it works directly in browser. So, what are you using for development? Browser sync or something like this, or a Python web server, or?
So most of the time, I just run Chrome, and there's a flag you can pass it to give it a custom DevTools location. And so we bundle DevTools and we run Chrome with -- custom DevTools frontend, I think, and just a folder is the output, and that will work. If I'm working on just one single component, we've also got. It's not quite. Have you come across Storybook? I think it's Storybook. It's kind of like the
Storybook,
sort of component doc thing. So we have a not as sophisticated or complete version, but we have a thing like Storybook for web components that we have. So if I'm working on one component and I don't need the whole of DevTools to work on it, I can just load up that component in a browser and just keep working on it. And we don't actually have anything like browser sync. I would just manually refresh the page. I think that would be a reasonable thing for us to add. So I can do that, or I just fire up DevTools with my custom DevTools build.
And is
that way.
Your Storybook replacement open source, or is it like internal?
It's open source, yeah. So
what's the name?
Well, you just had to find the DevTools front end repository.
Okay.
And there'll be a folder in there called front end UI docs or something. Can't quite remember. I should say it's very, very lightweight and rudimentary. Like it doesn't have any of the sophisticated features Storybook has, but it has enough for us. But yes, that is open source.
Also, what interests me, the TypeScript story, because I'm a little bit more, bare metal than you are, because what I'm doing, I'm using just straight ES6, and with Visual Studio Code, for me, the code completion and refactoring capabilities are good enough. Actually, are amazing, I have to say. But behind the scenes, Visual Studio Code converts, of course, the JavaScript to TypeScript, but I don't care about that. I don't have to do any transpilation, no TSC, nothing. What do you think about that? So is it reasonable just to use ES6, or do you need some specific TypeScript features?
I don't think you need them. I think I really like working with TypeScript, and I think it just adds that little layer on top of what VS Code and similar can provide. We do pay a decent cost in running TypeScript, though, on all those files. So that is the exact trade-off, and we've picked the TypeScript side of the trade-off, and you've picked the JavaScript side of the trade-off. I did have a side project where I was using JavaScript, but adding JS.comments to code, and TypeScript can support those. So you can say in a JavaScript comment like @type string or @type whatever. And that was quite a good experience because I didn't have to do any TypeScript bundling, but VS Code understands all those annotations. And so that felt like a nice middle ground. The syntax for declaring types in comments is not as nice as being able to do it in the code itself. It's a little bit more clunky, that has to be expected. But I think that's a nice middle ground. So I think it's just one of those things where it really depends you as a team, like what you want to optimize for.
It's a funny story, interesting story in my world. So Java developers know far more patterns than JavaScript, or use far more patterns than the JavaScript community does. So we have proxies, dynamic proxies, factories, and decorators, and interceptors, and whatever. And the problem I have is whatever I told you right now is possible with TypeScript, but impossible with JavaScript, or harder to achieve with JavaScript. And what I see in projects that the enterprise project, they try to do the same Java code in TypeScript, which is very possible, but maybe not idiomatic in web, and is going far too complex. Also, the funny story with the types, everyone would like to have the types, and then at one point of time in TypeScript, what I see a lot, they just use type any because they cannot, manage the types anymore. So we have a strange, Frankenstein, where we have some things which are type safe, and the other times where you suspect to be type safe is not type safe. So this is what I see a
Yeah.
lot. So for me, it's better to say, okay, we are not type safe, and we write more tests.
I would agree with that. The moment you use any in TypeScript, you've effectively turned TypeScript off for that particular chunk of the code. So I think there are a couple of any's floating around, but certainly we wouldn't allow any new code with any to land into the code base. That would be sort of flagged. And I think we even have an ESLint rule that disables it. I much prefer for that using the unknown type in TypeScript if you have to use something of that nature, because at least it doesn't then just let you use that value as if it were anything. You have to actually figure out what it is first. But yeah, I too have used code bases where there's a lot of any's, and it really defeats the purpose. And I agree, at that point, you're better off not having it, for sure.
Last question. So what is features you are really the most excited about, in the recent work you are doing in DevTools, which we can expect or you can talk about or whatever? Just promote a little bit, the DevTools, because I like them a lot. I already like the previous edition of the performance analyzer, with where you can select, the hotspot and you get sync in all the graphs. So it was actually great work already. So what happens to me right now with the new version? So what are the features you are working on?
Yeah, so the new it's called Performance Insights. What I'm really excited about with this one is I think the current panel is good, but requires you to be quite familiar with it and its concepts to be able to get the most out of it. It's not maybe the most intuitive, beginner-friendly thing to look at. So what I really like about Insights is you load it up, you run your website, and you literally on the right-hand side get a column that says, here's all the what we call insights. So here's, like, for example, a network request that blocked and slowed down rendering. Here's a layout shift that was bad and caused a bad experience. Here's your largest contentful paint metric score. And by the way, the reason this is slow is because of this request and because of this and that. And so I'm really excited to hopefully allow people who maybe haven't tackled their web performance and aren't experts on it to have a nicer sort of entry point into, okay, let's begin to figure out if we can improve the scores there. So we have a long way to go. The panel is an experiment, so it's on by default. You'll see it. It has a little experimental icon on it. There's plenty more to do there. It's far from finished, but I really like the idea of lowering the bar to figuring out why your website's performance is or isn't sort of as you would like, and that's really exciting for me.
So if someone would like to check out, the power of web components, they should try out the newest performance insights, right?
Yeah, and also there's another new panel called the Recorder panel, which I haven't worked on personally, but it lets you record like user flows on your website and rerun them. That's also entirely web components driven. So any new panels that land into DevTools or big new UI features, they're almost certainly exclusively web components. So I think that's really exciting. A lot of people say, well, you can't do big, complicated apps with web components. Or a lot of the conversations I have with people is, okay, web components are great for a tiny side project, but once you get to a certain size, they don't do this, they don't do that, they break down. I don't think that's true. I think now we are beginning to be able to point to lots of projects, not just at Google and DevTools. It's like, no, you can achieve a lot with them. It just takes a little bit of thought. So yeah, people enjoying new DevTools panels are using 100% web component based implementations.
So Record is actually interesting. So it sounds almost to me like a parts of Cypress, right? Where you can walk through the page, like automation almost.
Yeah, so it will generate a Puppeteer script. So Puppeteer is the sort of browser automation library, and so it can generate a Puppeteer script that you can take and work with. So for example, if you want to use end-to-end tests using Puppeteer, you can kind of get a jump start by recording what you want to test in DevTools. That will give you a script you can copy and paste and save and tweak as you need to tweak it. And there's more coming there as well. I think, again, that's another panel that's marked as an experiment because it's fairly new and we're actively seeking feedback. That's another thing I should say for the Insights panel. There's a feedback link there. We want to hear as much feedback as possible. Like we want to proactively solve pain points that people have with debugging their web performance. So we're trying to launch things as experiments so we can gather more feedback more quickly.
Where people can find you on internet and know if you have any links, I will also add them to show notes.
Yeah, it's Jack_Franklin on Twitter and jackfranklin.co.uk. for the blog. And those are really the best place to find me.
I think it was fun. It was really interesting to me that actually you're doing almost exactly the same what I'm doing, and you are now the high-end Google Chrome projects. I'm in boring enterprise projects, and we have almost very, very similar architectures with similar motivations coming from completely different background. And I really enjoyed the conversation actually.
Yeah, same. No, it was great to talk it through. Thank you again for inviting me on.
Thank you.
Thanks.